Welcome, everyone. We have, instead of going through all the introductions, I'd like to just sort of jump into the discussion. People's names are above their heads. Not exactly their heads, but we can figure out who people are as we go. I'll get it going. But what we wanted to do today is to really hold a discussion. And I don't want this to be sort of just like a typical panel so much as actually trying to come up with something that is useful and practical and that we can drive forward. And that is a statement of innovation principles that we can work off of and do something interesting with. And because we didn't want to start with a completely blank slate, we threw together 4 starting innovation principles that are certainly not complete and might not even be very good, but it is a starting point. And so I wanted to sort of, first of all, thank all of you for joining us and begin to go through and see what we could do in having this discussion. I'm not going to edit this as we go, but we do have people in the audience who are taking notes, and we're going to take what the discussion leads to and then continue the discussion around it. So I wanted to start just with a general discussion and kind of ask, we'll go sort of down the row, and you can say your name so people can associate who you are, but just a general question in terms of from your position as lawyers, and I will say that potentially someone in this audience, did ask me, why are you having lawyers on the stage? Because they're the least innovative people. Which I thought was a little unfair. I did not say this. And also that lawyers tend to be, the most focused on avoiding liability rather than sometimes taking the chances that need to be taken. And I said, this was my response, which was, if we can convince the lawyers that these are good ideas, maybe we have something to go with. And so I wanted to ask you, from your position as these boring, non-innovative lawyers, which I'm joking, every one of you I know is actually not like that. We could have picked the boring ones, but we avoided them. What do you think is actually most important in terms of leading to good innovation for startup companies and technology companies today? We'll start with Paul.
Thank you. Paul Szymanski, General Counsel of Automatic. And I, for one, Mike, applaud you for the bold choice of choosing the lawyers to lead the panel on innovation. It's like having a panel on wildlife conservation led by big game hunters or something like that. But I think the question is great. And for me, it's really about, kind of operating as the only lawyer in a company that not only is a tech company, but is just almost entirely populated by developers, very few business people, very few, overhead, so to speak. I think for me, it's very much about I've had to unlearn, I think, a lot of the things that I learned as legal training, and to really add value and sort of drive our company forward and just innovation in general, taking a lot of inspiration from, I think, the people that are actually doing the work and who are the innovators. I think I would agree with people that would question lawyers of being innovative. I think we can be innovative, but I think that especially in the world of technology, it's not really us that's the builders in a lot of ways. And I think we can be that, and for me to kind of get towards that more, it really is getting a lot of inspiration from being around the people that are doing the work, and just looking at your kind of first cut at the principles. They really struck me as not so much anything that's legal or policy oriented, but kind of reminded me that, if you would ask an engineer at Automatic, like, what do they think is innovation, they would come up with a list that's very similar. And I think if you look at the way the internet works and the things that have made it great, it's not anything that we've really added to it as lawyers. If anything, we've hurt it in a lot of ways by trying to protect IP, make things proprietary. Very much it's about the people that kind of built it. Where were they coming from? They work transparently, they work very openly, they share a lot of ideas, and I think it comes from them, and I always try to think about that when I'm acting as a lawyer.
Ken?
Hi, I'm Ken Carter. I'm Cloudflare's in-house counsel. And I think to answer your question directly, what's the most important part of innovation? I think you started to touch on it actually in your opening remarks. and when you were talking about this inadvertent aspect of the law where they had allowed, the state of California had disallowed, rather, non-restrictive covenants, non-compete covenants, rather. And I think from the beginning, ex ante, you never know what's going to work and what's not going to work, and that's really at the heart of innovation. So you have to have a system that's flexible. You have to have a system that encourages experimentation, and you have to have a system that tolerates failure and recovers from failure quite quickly. So it's not just employment law, but corporate law as well. When I lived in Europe, I was frequently asked, well, why don't we have a Silicon Valley in the Rhine Valley? Why don't we have a Silicon Valley in the Loire Valley? And one of the you got all the standard responses, and I think you added one today. And if I could add one, it's that of liability. If something fails, there's responsibility, but there's also the ability to recover and come back from it and start something new, because you don't know what's going to be successful from the beginning.
Okay, Liz?
Hi, Liz Simon from General Assembly. I would agree with everything that was said so far. One of the work values that we have at General Assembly is start with yes. As a lawyer, I think probably everyone on this panel could relate to that sort of, not necessarily everyone's first, first position, but I think having that in mind, being the only lawyer in a startup has sort of really helped me to make decisions that are, helping my business continue to innovate and, push the boundaries even where, I wouldn't otherwise be comfortable doing that. And so I think that's sort of that, and that nimbleness that you were describing is sort of really, really key to innovation. That's the thing. We're always changing. We're always sort of moving and growing and iterating. And that's been really exciting for me to see from the inside and see how companies really push forward. And I think, in terms of the framework, the sort of initial framework that you threw up there, it resonated with me because for two reasons. One, because, for General Assembly as a company, I think, all of those things resonate in a way, and we could talk more about that. But I think also, what we do as a company is really train the next generation of technologists, developers, designers, product managers, people that we're putting out into the world and sending them out into the world, into technology and non-technology companies alike. And so these are sort of key to what we're instilling in, all the people that come through our doors. And it's in the classrooms, it's, what our instructors teach, and sort of all pervasive. And so I think it's really important to sort of think about these things in the context of, the people who are sort of like going to continue to do this work and learning these skills and going forward. So I think it's a really nice starting place.
Bart?
Hey there, I am Bart Volkmer. I'm at Dropbox, not a general counsel. So I'm innovating here by crashing the general counsel's roundtable. When I looked at these four principles, I thought they were really fantastic. They all resonated with me. And then I started thinking a little bit about a layer up from them, which is what's overriding all of this. And I think what I came to was we do all this stuff, and we try to get to a place where we're in line with a lot of these because we want to do what's right for our users, and we say what is the way that we can be facilitating a delightful experience for our users, to have the internet be a great place for the people that are using all of the services, for the people up on stage. And I think that that's where, as lawyers, we can be extraordinarily helpful by being advocates for our users and trying to make the experience fantastic. And I think if you start there and then you get down to some of these principles, it makes a lot of sense when you look at it through that prism of not what's great for the company, which is part of your job is to protect the company, but also what's great for the users and to be big advocates for the users when you're in rooms and you're having debates and you're making decisions and you're working with product and business people on tough decisions as attorneys.
Vidya?
Hi, I'm Vidya Gatti, the General Counsel of Twitter. Obviously echo a lot of what was said before me. I think when I look at these four principles of innovation, they really resonate to how we've built Twitter and how we've built the Twitter legal department, so I'm looking forward to talking about that. And I really wanted to drill down on what I think has allowed us to do that, even now as a public company and a much larger company than some. And I think it's really attracting mission-driven people and preserving that culture. because that's always been kind of core to what we're doing, and thinking about it from our user perspective, but thinking about it from our developer perspective. When I look at the Innovators Patent Agreement, which Ben Lee on my team came up with, like, that's something that he and some engineers were talking about one night. This wasn't for the bottom line of Twitter. This was really just about how can we better serve like the needs of our employees in a bigger picture sense, and then creating rewards for those taking those chances and being innovative that are outside of the box. Because again, you can't measure that in terms of specific value. And the many hours I made Ben talking to the SEC about what this contract even meant, seemed painful for him at the time. But I think it's important to reward that and tolerate failure, because that is a possible outcome for trying to be innovative, particularly in the legal sense, and having a culture where that's accepted and actually encouraged is really important.
Great.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Blake from LinkedIn. I'd like to echo a couple of things. I think that both of what Bart and Jaya said echoed to me, really resonated in that. Number one, from a company perspective, you have to be thinking about the needs of your users, your members first, and good things are going to come from that if you do that. I think that's super important. And what you were saying about culture and values for a company really being something that can separate the good companies from the great ones. What I would say on top of that, I think the first question was, what's going to make innovation successful at a company, or innovation successful more general? I think these are great principles that you have up here. One thing that I would add, really, that sometimes is overlooked is the importance of operational excellence. We at LinkedIn tend to think about our CEO is relentless on talking about focus, and that goes through on a number of principles, one of which is we're going to do fewer things done better. We're going to communicate the right information to the right people at the right time. And my personal favorite, which is very counter to most lawyers, is the S of that focus is you're going to focus on the speed and quality of your decision making. So speed and quality, both of them. What I'd say is that there's principles, and then you need to be able to operate, and that you need to also have that focus on not just having the ideas, and I think that one of the things I want to laud you about, and when you're in this inaugural meeting for Copia, is the focus on trying to be action oriented, and so I think that that's great, because I think that the successful, innovative companies are the ones that have the principles, but then aren't just dreaming big, but also getting the stuff done. So.
Hi there, Danelle Dixon-Thayer. I'm the General Counsel, and I also lead our policy and business development team at Mozilla. So it's a little bit of a different role, because it comprises the business affairs of the company, but my lawyers on the legal team also work with that. When it was funny when you said that about lawyers not being innovative, my first thought was, if any of you have lawyers that aren't innovative, you should fire them. Because that's what we do, and in the legal team is the very first thing that I talk to my lawyers about when they're going to go meet with any of our product teams or any of our business guys, is you need to think outside the box, and you need to remove roadblocks. And that's the most important thing, because that's what we're here for. We're not here to tell you what you can't do, because we could do that all day. We're here to help you to get where you want to get to. And so that's one of the things I think that's the genesis of maybe why the panel was pulled together. In terms of what a company needs to, when I saw these innovation principles, I thought this is very much like Mozilla. It's like our mission. We have all of these things. We have openness. We have community. We strive for interoperability. We want to build for the web. And then the transparency part. This stuff's hard. I mean, I was laughing when you said operational excellence. We suck at that. We try really, really hard to be good about the operational excellence, but when you have all of these things that you're pulling together, it makes it really hard to operate in an efficient and excellent manner. We want that. We strive for that too, but it's hard. The things that I think of, and one of the things that we try to do at Mozilla in the policy team and in the legal team is really pull together ideas for startups and how startups can be better and how they can focus on things at the front end of their business. And one of the most important things, I think, is trust. And I think that that's folded into this transparency piece, but it's trust of your users. We need the users to trust the web, right? We need them to trust the web. If they don't trust the web, they're not going to trust any of us, no matter what we're doing. So we need them to trust the web. That's a lot about transparency. It's a lot about providing users information about their data. But it's also thinking in the very beginning of your business about how you're going to, what kind of data you're going to collect. Don't collect it all. Let's figure out what we need at the outset. I know some people say it's harder to get more later, but it's actually really not. You have to just demonstrate the need. So I think that the trust piece and how you structure that in the very beginning is the most important thing. That's the hardest thing to get back once you lose it, and you need to start from that place of getting it. And then the openness part, I think building for the web and generating, we're very focused on the openness of the web and open source, and not everybody needs to be there. We think it's a good idea, but I get that that's not the way it works for everyone. But if we think about openness and interoperability sort of going hand in hand, the thing that scares me right now is you look at the IoT space, for example, it's all very much a walled garden in terms of where the data is flowing. If we could actually create this notion of interoperability and openness, we could actually gather so much information. I could actually create like my phone, my camera, my television. It could all go into a space that's for me, all of my data that I can then let you guys all into through an API. So there's things that I think if we can get to that interoperability and openness, that's I think how we can get to real innovation. And if we're not afraid of pushing that out there and letting others copy us, which is the best thing, and that's what we think is a really great thing, people can innovate on top and they can layer in. So from my standpoint, those are the things that if we build for the web, if we strive for trust, and we focus on openness and interoperability, we can actually all get to a better place.
That's great. Yeah. So one of the things that I want to, in terms of like the 4 things that we have up here, I mean, I think people said, that they're generally good, but are there ones that we should change? I mean, I think you made a really good point about saying trust, and sort of trust is built into some of these, but I actually think, building trust is a really key point, and, maybe that's something that should be called out as a separate one, or.
So what we like to think about this from is that right now the currency on the web is data. Data is the currency in terms of how the internet gets done, right? And I think that if we can move that to it being trust as being the currency, I think we're all going to benefit, because then users are going to, the trust piece, you bring transparency to it, they share more data with you, you get to use that data in a way, you engage them in the value exchange, it actually moves things forward. So I like the trust part. It's hard maybe to get a touch and feel of, but.
No, I think it's good. But do other people have opinions in terms of, like the 4 things that are up there? And I know that, we've brought up a couple more, but in terms of the 4 that we started with, do any of them need to change? Should we take any of them out? Or does anyone have, yeah?
I have 2 additions.
2
additions. I'd like to see 2 other
we
things
can
up
go
there.
do the additions, sure.
I'd like to, at some level it's covered by openness, but I think flexibility and the ability to take something that what it wasn't designed for and repurpose it and use it in a new way. That's sort of openness, but it's, I think, just enough not overlap that you can do something here. And the other thing that's missing is interconnection, right? Because interoperability is useless if it's not connected to other things. And so going back again to your opening remarks, it's got to be abundantly interconnected. So, because a device sitting by itself is not as useful as a device interconnected to others.
Great. Anyone else have silence? Okay. So and I was sort of trying to think about, there's a concept that Tim O'Reilly, who I think probably many of you guys know who he is, he's sort of been pushing out this idea for many years that what companies really need to do is sort of figure out how to create more value for the world than they take from the world. And I really like that idea. And I was sort of trying to figure out how do you sort of put that into these kinds of principles, or even does that make sense as sort of a principle concept? And I think, Bart, I mean, to some extent you were saying that in terms of, focusing on making things good for your users, the users first, and I think, almost everyone on this panel views that as sort of a key thing. But is there a way to sort of bring that concept into these principles so that people think about, you can, expand the pie, you can still capture a bunch of the pie yourself, but if you're expanding that pie bigger than, than just what you're taking out of it, that's generally a good thing, not just for your companies, but for the world as a whole. Is there a way to sort of express that as a principle? Is anyone, did I scare you all off? Go ahead.
I feel like the openness principle sort of captured that for me, and perhaps it's in the sort of thoughts you shared with us that sort of flushed that out. But I mean, I agree with that. I think that, you know, and I think that all the technologists who actually work within our companies sort of do what they do for that reason also, right? So it's important to the company, and it should be important to all of us. So I think the openness part captures that well. I don't know if you need to call it a separate principle or a separate category, but I definitely like having something like that included.
Well, I think for some people, sometimes openness seems sort of vague, right? And you know, what does that entail? And I think this is a little bit of a different concept, but I mean, they could be related, and perhaps we could, you know, sort of change the way we describe the openness concept to be something else. But
I think that that statement is such a great statement. I think it's super hard to do in practice, right? I think what's the KPI to determine that you're actually bringing more value than you're taking? But I think that a lot of us up here work for companies that are mission-oriented, have a mission that they follow. Not every one of them has the foundation in terms of what we have, but I think that the mission part is a way to really focus on that. I think structuring your business, especially in California as a public benefit corporation, then it makes you, it's certainly tied to that mission. I don't know, that might be one way to sort of encourage that.
So one idea might be, I think most, if not all, of the companies here have a focus on long-term value as opposed to short-term value. So that concept where, so a number of the companies here are what you're thinking about or dealing with is the overall benefits of network effects, right? So the fact of the matter is, you know, a lot of the business here are like, you know, built on a freemium model or something similar, freemium or advertising, et cetera, where you're going to provide a lot of value to people for free, and there will be some exchange, and it's not about harvesting short-term value, but looking at the long-term value and recognizing as part of that if you have a network, then you need to, it's critical to not look for short-term value, because then people will leave. And the value is having a giant network where people can share with each other and get more value, and it just good things keep on coming.
But how do you get that? I mean, how do you get the company to realize that? Because I think, I mean, for lots of companies will say that, and then when the opportunity comes up to take short-term value, it can be very tempting, especially if a company may be struggling. So how do you structure things in a company so that you keep people focused on sort of the long-term value as opposed to just grabbing the short-term opportunities?
Yeah, I would actually. I mean, I know that this is really scary that I'm going to say this, but make sure that you have a dual class structure, and that way you don't have to take short-term gains. And I'm sitting next to someone who has one, and we don't. And it's a very different approach to going public if you're going to go that route. Obviously, when you're a private company, you have much more flexibility, but I do think that part of focusing on the long term is having the runway to do that, and that means having stockholders and investors who are going to support that as well.
That's great. Paul?
I think the idea that Bart first brought up, which was being very in tune with and responsive to your users, I think is super important to all of it, because it's interesting with a technology company or any piece of technology or product that we would come up with as a company, you put a lot of thought into building it and then releasing it, but then as soon as you release it on day one, it's almost not yours anymore. You know, like you have another constituency that is just as important, if not more so, than, you know, the people that built it. So I think, and we're just very acutely aware of that at Automatic, because we just depend so much on WordPress, which is an open source software project that we by no means control. I mean, it's thousands of people that are writing the code that we depend on for our business. So being very in tune and kind of part of that ecosystem, I think, you know, we're probably a very extreme example of that, but every company, I think, in some way, once you have that other constituency that you have to think about, that really, if you listen to it and you do a good job of it, that really puts the long-term focus into perspective, I think.
Are there ways to really get the employees of the company to recognize that, right? So I think that's one of the challenges where it's easy sometimes to talk about these things, but what can you do to actually, have that happen in practice? Did I stump everyone?
We have some experience with that, and Cloudflare is growing quite quickly. I'm employee number 52. We're going to hit about 150 in the next week or two, so we're doubling every year at this rate. And when I came to the company, there was 50 minutes of training, and now there's a week. And part of that training is instilling our values, and those flow down from the CEO, and they flow up from, we don't have a mailroom, but if we had a mailroom, they'd flow up from there. And it's about hearing the same thing 3 or 4 times in the first week. We're in a trust-based business, and if we don't behave responsibly and transparently, we will not be in that business for very long. And they need to hear, we will not violate our privacy policy. They need to hear that 3 times in the first week. And the other thing that we do is, now that we have this training program for the new employees, the old employees don't go through it, but they hear it from the new employees. The new employees hear, oh, this is the way we've always done it. And they pull the new employees say, this is the way we've always done it. And the new employees kind of have to go along.
Interesting. So if we, just getting back to these principles in terms of, if we're taking, we have some descriptions below, kind of, we have openness, and we say, the design for open innovation and encourage to contribute and things like that. Do you think that there, beyond those descriptions, is there more that we can add to sort of flesh these out, to make people realize, what can actually be done? Again, sort of getting back to trying to, how can we make these so that, beyond just reading it, actually people put it into practice? Nobody wants to answer that one?
Well, I think one of the things about these is they probably mean different things to different companies. So making sure that we have room that we can interpret what this means for each individual company, I think is going to be important. And maybe you do want to keep it pretty open-ended to allow for that.
Yeah. Well, the plan is certainly not to lock everyone into lockstep, and that's in part in terms of the way that we sort of describe these initially. They are somewhat vague, and so maybe we should keep them vague enough, but we want them to be at least we don't want them so vague that they can mean absolutely anything, right? And so sort of figuring out the balance there is important.
So I wondered, in terms of the community one, we have a community at Mozilla. When I first came to Mozilla, that was one of the most unusual and scariest things to deal with. It's not so scary anymore, but it's still unusual sometimes. Not everybody can have the same type of community that we have. So I was a little bit, this describes us quite well in terms of the contribution, the open source project, and in terms of truly we have this community that goes out. But we have a foundation, and so the foundation actually, they can volunteer through the foundation. For-profit entities, I was just, how do you actually can't have a community in that same way? So do you mean like a community of users, or I guess that was a hard one for me.
Yeah, it could be, and everybody else on the panel for the most part, I think, is for-profit companies, right? So we can sort of hear, but I think, most of these, Twitter obviously they are a community, right? It builds all different kinds of communities, and WordPress is all about building communities as well. So I think there's all kinds of different communities that can be built, and Techdirt, with what we've done, we have a community, and we're a for-profit entity. And so there's, I don't think community is, defaults automatically to it must be a nonprofit or a foundation or something like that. But that does raise a good question. For other companies, do other companies think that community is not that important? Cloudflare, for example, you could make an argument that community might not be as important to you as to others. Or you can disagree.
We don't have a community in the sense that Paul has a community where we have people committing code to our code base. Mm-hmm. But the way the network works is it is a community. We liken it to a neighborhood watch. That if we see something nefarious going on with one of our free customers' websites, we can use that information to protect a paying customer and vice versa. So the network grows stronger with each additional participant, and those people are we're mediating that relationship, but it is a community, and without that community, the network wouldn't function.
I would say General Assembly has like a really different type of community, but also one that resonated. So I think to the point of having broad principles that everyone can sort of relate to in their own way. So, the mission of the company is building a community of people empowered to pursue work they love. And so our community is, over 200,000 students who've taken courses with us who are part of our alumni community. It's a really different way of thinking about an alumni community or network, right, than we're probably used to thinking about. But these are people who've been to, one of our 14 global campuses or taken an online course or something like that. And so those people have platforms and ways to engage with each other, separate and apart from General Assembly. They can engage with us. And so, I looked at that and that's what I thought of, right, which was very, very different, I'm sure, than most folks here. But I liked it and I felt like it worked for us.
I tend to think this is actually a really important component, and if you're going to add value to your users, that's kind of where I started this conversation. Like, we want to be able to add value to our users. You have to listen to them, and I think for me, one of the most inspiring things about working where I work is, our founders were, created forums, and we're in those forums at 4 in the morning, solving bugs for customers because they were so passionate about it, about making the experience great for users. And I think if you don't have that feedback loop, if you don't have a sense of community, if you don't build that out, you don't know if you're adding value or how to add value for your users. If we start, we want to have a principle that says you're going to make the world a better place, you're going to add value to your users, you have to know how they're interacting with your product, what they want, and how they want you to change. So I think this is important.
Yeah, I was going to say, that raises an interesting one that isn't really directly listed here, which is just listening, right? Listening to your users or partners or whatever, and maybe that's in community and maybe that's in openness, but maybe that's worth calling out separately too. Just the idea that, understanding, obviously your users, that's standard. Everyone says you want to listen to your customers, but listening to, other partners and others in the world around you as well, right?
It's almost the flip side of transparency, like getting the feedback.
Yeah.
Telling them what's happening and getting the feedback.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's one of these things where, they are flip sides, and it's funny because people sometimes confuse them, even though they are flip sides. And we have, I keep complaining about one particular government agency that keeps talking about how transparent it is just because it listens. And I'm like, listening is information coming in, transparency is information going out. And so I think it's important to consider that.
Yeah, I was just going to add, there's I think a component of this community that would be collaboration between companies as well.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things people run into trouble with is, like, say, IP enforcement, where they're being super aggressive on IP enforcement when they could just send a nice note to their colleague at another company, or if there's common security vulnerabilities in code and the code base is shared because it's open source, and the way you interact with other companies to alert them to that to protect the users. I think that is something that maybe isn't reflected in these 4, but I think is also very important, kind of the spirit of collaboration between the companies to improve the experience.
Yeah, and I think, to some extent that goes back to what I was talking about in the early presentation, where you look at, some of these big developments, and what happened is because different people were communicating across companies, even when they may seem like competitors, because of those conversations, you can get the big breakthroughs that then allows competition between those companies. But, it's sort of a friendly competition that actually, again, sort of creates a bigger space to play in and compete. And yeah, maybe there's something that needs to be in there about having that, as opposed to just sort of siloing everyone into your company and not letting them look out.
Yeah, I agree with that, and it was something I was thinking as I was reading them, is that if I had a bone to pick with some of the criteria, it would be that they're a little bit passive, frankly. And I think, instead of saying transparency, I would almost say something like, or maybe add to it, like advocacy. Like, it's great to have feedback, it's great to listen to it, but you got to do something too at the end of the day. And same thing with transparency, with openness. It's great to sort of put all this stuff out there, but it's even better to, with something like security, do a blog post that's like, hey, we found this thing, here's what we're doing about it. Going back to my, kind of how my developers would approach it, like, great to report a bug, better to fix the bug. So that's how I would think about it, is how can we make this more proactive than I originally read it, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's really good. Do other people, adding sort of advocacy component to it?
Yeah, echo on what Bart was saying about the community of companies. I think that's absolutely critical. I look at this list and I say to myself, yeah, we do this, but there's a cost for doing this stuff. It's a cost that we think in the long term is the right thing for our company and our users, but there is a cost in having a community of companies that believe these things and are standing up and talking to each other about these things. I think can make a real difference, not just for us, but for the companies that are coming along the way.
To Paul's point, I think the sort of concept of engaging is sort of like the more active form of like the combination of like listening and transparency. Like I think, especially as we think about working with governments and working with policymakers, like that, those are the really sort of core things when I think about sort of what we probably all do and or have teams that do. It's like that two-way dialogue, and so to the extent that that can be captured somewhere in here, I think that's sort of really critical to the broader mission of what I think you're getting at.
Yeah, and I think that gets to something that I sort of was thinking is also, missing to some extent, which is the sort of policy component to it. And, obviously a lot of the stuff that we're talking about is how does this, relate back to policy? And a lot of these are more about, directly with users and stuff, but and you've talked about, with other companies and partners and stuff, but also on the government side as well, in terms of how the different companies are approaching working with the government. Certainly right now, there's lots of talk about Silicon Valley and not being happy with the government, and figuring out the ways to handle these things. And it's been interesting. I mean, just in the last few years, for example, to some extent, I guess maybe this gets to the transparency angle, but there have been all these transparency reports, and it almost feels like, a lot of companies are, which is great for me to see, trying to one-up each other in terms of, how cool and creative their transparency reports are. And that's something that's just sort of happened in this, sort of somewhat friendly, I think, competition between people who, and I get, press releases and press people from some of your companies saying, look at this neat new element that we added to our transparency report. And it's, it's great. And I'm wondering if, if there's some way to sort of get that element and sort of, how you interact on the government side and the policy side of things.
I think that it's really important in terms of the policy piece. We've worked so much with so many of your companies in terms of trying to get to the right place on policy. Sometimes it doesn't even involve the government. It just involves us trying to like self-regulate and create standards. And that's what we've been trying to do. If you think net neutrality is one of those few ones that a lot of us got together and said regulation is a good thing, a lot of times we're not fighting for regulation. We're actually fighting to say, hey, we can work together and make this right. That's a really important one. So if you can think about that collaboration, I don't think it falls, in my view, not in the community one. I think it comes outside of that. I think it really is in terms of creating, working with with your peers in that space to create standards. I'm not saying that they're standards that go through W3C or anything like that, but standards that actually everybody can sort of vow to live by.
Yeah, I mean, it's, again, one of the challenges I know that I've heard from some of you directly and from some other people in the audience too, just, a lot of like policy challenges that come up, it becomes a very reactive situation where, oftentimes, people are sort of suddenly, okay, there's a policy on the table that needs to be stopped or fixed or changed or whatever, and then suddenly everyone's sort of scrambling to try and get it together. And some of hopefully what we're trying to do is get some of these issues, on radars early on, so that we can, help to coordinate responses like that. But what else do you think can be done to kind of try and deal with situations where you're trying to deal with the government?
I'll go back to the transparency and I guess openness. I mean, I think that I've actually worked in government myself, so I've worked on both sides of this, and I think that there is often real just lack of understanding of what it is that we all do, and I think so to the extent that we are being transparent about whether it's holding ourselves to some self-regulated set of standards that we agree on, and we say like these are sort of quality indicators, and putting that out there in for example, a nascent industry that, governments are having a hard time understanding or something like that. Like I think both probably transparency is sort of where I see that most neatly fitting up there, but I think sort of putting information out there and helping educate is like something that I think is a core part of it.
Well, go ahead.
We've gotten involved in policy process very, very early for a young company. Part of that is just a function of my background and my interest, and which aligns with my CEO. And some of it is, down the road, some really bad governmental decisions can hurt us. So we've started with a small policy team. We've been involved in Washington. I've been going out there on a relatively regular basis and doing hill trips. And we have no ask. I don't need anything for you. I'm not lobbying. I don't want you to change a rule or do anything. I just see 5% of the internet on a daily basis, and I thought you would want to know what I've learned doing this. And sometimes I get really hard, difficult questions from someone who's very informed and wants to know how we do our interconnects and if we're having trouble with them and what do they look like and how many of them are written down. And then I get the person who's really interested but knows nothing and is sort of ashamed to ask questions because doesn't want to appear as a novice. And you have to be sort of like, look, this is coming out here is a fringe benefit for me. I get to tell you about what I do. That's cool. And you can just very delicately explain, well, this is what we mean when we say, this is what an encryption key is. An encryption key is just part of a really large prime number. And it's difficult in that it's a very, very retail business. You can't do that wholesale. You have to go in and meet people and have people help you navigate to the right people in the right office, and then explain to them, encryption key, it's a prime number.
That's so important. I think that I can't express how important that is because the staffers sometimes are totally educated, but to get it up to sometimes the senior staffers and certainly to the members, it's hard, and you really do have to do it on a one-off. But it's if we all do it, and most all of us here do, get out there and talk to them, it really benefits the web. So
maybe one of the commitments is a DC field trip.
It's not even DC, it's also the commission, right? The EC, all of us are going to have to work with the EC. And so making sure that we spend, and we have a really small policy group, but we try to spend at least 2 or 3 trips a year to go to the EC. We don't have a lot of data right now. I see at some point we're going to move into that space more. But in terms of really understanding what's going on and really educating them on what happens in this whole notion of balkanization of the internet and how that affects us all. And it's really important because when you sit in this world, when you sit in a country that's already very, very pro-privacy or pro-those issues, you forget about what might happen outside. So it's really incumbent upon us. So I think that it's not just DC, it's really just policy. It's really getting to the policy piece and educating policymakers globally.
Yeah, and I totally agree with all that, and I think it really does all start with good information. And, if you talk to, like you said, if you talk to the congressional staffers, some of them think there's 2 websites on the internet. There's Pirate Bay and Google. And they have this secret agreement where one of them but I sort of don't fault them because we're not really trying hard enough, I don't think, to really educate. And I think to make the principles more active, I think beyond transparency, it really is actively getting the information out there. And to your point in your opening remarks, which I really like, just the idea of, hey, stay out of our way, sort of the deal being, hey, you stay out of our way, we'll stay out of yours, and we'll both be fine. I don't think that really works, and I think we really do as an industry, as a group of companies that care about this stuff, have to do more to just, if nothing else, just educate a little bit about what we're doing and how just basic things, how the internet works.
Yeah, I'd just like to say I don't think that's fair because I think most of them are on Twitter too. So.
Fair enough.
Isn't it that I just saw this, I was at Mobile World Congress last week and I was on a panel with these folks and they were saying that most people in emerging markets that have the internet.org, they think Facebook is the internet. So but we should educate against that too.
I think the other thing is, it's not like it's not because we're not doing enough. I think we also have to recognize that there's also, I think, a lot of money and resources being expended to put misinformation out there. I think, if we don't say anything and just sort of let the process play out, there's huge companies, there's other industries that will tell the story for us, and they are.
Yeah, and that sort of gets to the other point, which is that you have often, huge, sometimes, very old industries that have very strong policy efforts that are deeply hooked into to different government agencies where, that's not true of anyone on this stage. And so, one of the things that I think is interesting and would love for you guys to discuss also is ways that, I don't think any, as far as I know, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think any of you want to build up that kind of policy operation, that has, that much, lobbying and dollars and everything flowing into DC, because I don't think anyone thinks that that's, a good way to spend the money. But we are all very innovative companies that have innovative ways of doing things, and in fact, often have innovative ways of communicating and educating and letting people know this stuff. So what are the kinds of things that you can do to sort of take advantage of that ability to communicate and to educate through the very tools that you guys build? No one wants to?
Well, if you remember, a couple of years ago, PIPA and that, I mean, we had a lot of companies did the internet blackout, which was obviously very effective. That wasn't necessary for net neutrality, which is good. But that's certainly one way of collectively showing the power of the companies together.
Yeah, I mean, and I think obviously that was really interesting because it was a chance for both the companies themselves and their users to kind of align and do something and make a stand and do so in a very public way. And I think, and it's a great example, and it's one that comes up for very good reason, I think, over and over again, but it's also one that people point out, you can't do that with every issue, right? And so, I'm just trying to think through what other things can be done and what other ways can you have an impact as mostly smaller companies to do things. And maybe it's as simple as every once in a while going to DC and just continually talking to people. Or maybe it's, and Sacramento, yes, not forgetting local states and elsewhere too. I mean, but certainly California policy, which affects everyone here, but also has a much wider impact because once if you have a state law in California, it tends to impact everyone else in the country as well. So what else?
Just a quick shout out to the New York tech companies because they really led the way on net neutrality.
New Yorkers.
But so it just goes, and they were a lot of smaller companies, right? You didn't have the big internet giants leading the way, and they were able to make a difference by persevering, starting early, just continuous dialogue and meetings and, phone calls shaming all of us from time to time. So, I mean, it was good. It was exciting to see them be able to do that, and I think it's an inspiration to us all.
That's great. So, in terms of taking these principles that we've talked about and some of the other ones, and we've been taking notes, and we'll sort of try and regroup and take them, and we're going to bring them and have people discuss them tomorrow, and then further we'll take them and put them online. What else do you think, in terms of action items, in terms of taking this forward and doing something useful with it, what else do you think that we can do? Come on, someone's got it.
Just to, as said before, maybe we coalesce on 3 issues that can cut across most companies. And maybe we should leave like network neutrality alone because it's already done. So pick something like transparency or bulk collection or encryption or IP blocking, something that cuts across everybody's. And we just commit to field trips and to talk about these issues that are of interest to all of us. And we don't even have to agree on what the outcome has to be. We just have to agree on what the issues of interest are.
That's good. Anyone else? Nobody else wants to go on field trips with Ken?
I think that's a great idea.
Yes to field trips.
I don't, are you asking how this can be useful outside? Is that essentially?
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that we're doing right now we call it the Lean Data Initiative, is we're trying to get this out to startups by working with venture capital firms and going and meeting with their portfolio businesses. Clearly, this is our mission. It's not part of what we're doing as our core company. But I think, and what we're trying to do there is like also put together things that startups can use. So like out of the box, like not privacy policies and that, but just like here's helpful tips on what you can do. This is the same kind of idea, like to put this out there and to make it be, something that people who are starting companies can start with, I think is a really great thing.
Yeah, I think what I would probably do is not try and figure it out right here today, but if you have the principles, then give to the company and have them come back to you. What is the way that you're going to implement, or what's the project that your company's working on that embodies these principles that we can put together and then use to inspire other companies? Like for us, I think about, one of the things that LinkedIn's trying to do is build the world's first economic graph, which is to basically digitally map the global economy. And one of the things we're doing in connection with that is we're doing what's called the Economic Graph Challenge, where we've put a challenge out to a number of researchers and saying, how can you use LinkedIn's data in a way that's going to, basically better people's lives in an economic way, right? So that, to me, is very consistent with the principles that are here. And I suspect that if that one idea would be, ask the companies on the stage, like, what's the project that they would be working on that they could sort of put as their example and contribute. It's also sort of, I think, arguably inspired by some of the things what you're saying here about let's not be centralized, let's be decentralized and have a community. And so then have the companies come back and all come forward, and maybe that grows and other companies say, okay, yeah, we're going to throw in too, and this is what we're doing.
It's sort of like a version of the commitment model of like,
Yeah.
Clean Global Initiative or something like that, right? Not quite as formal, but like, similar, sort of putting out commitments of things that we're, working on and want other people to see and sort of use as examples. I like that idea.
Yeah, I really like that idea too. So I want to bring up one last sort of concept or principle, and then we'll wrap this up and move on to the workshops and downstairs. And we're going to be discussing this tomorrow, but I want to bring it up with you guys because I was trying to figure out sort of where it fits in. We're going to have a whole discussion tomorrow on sort of freedom of expression and kind of the role that the technology industry plays in it. And it's one that I think, it comes back to people talk about it a lot, and almost everyone here in some way or another can argue that, the stuff that they're working on is really important to freedom of expression. I was trying to figure out, how do we sort of bake that concept as well, this idea of, enhancing freedom of expression around the globe? Is there a way to sort of bake that into these principles as well?
I think it touches on one of the things you started with, which is how do we make sure that we're enhancing value in the world as companies. I think every company is going to do this slightly differently. And that's obviously very core to our mission at Twitter, but it's not going to be the same for everyone. So I think this is more part of like, maybe it's not community, but what is the value that we're creating in the world, and not just the value we're taking away.
As you said that, I thought of the word responsibility, and I wonder if that's something that you could add to this, because responsibility might get to the policy piece, it might get to that piece, and it's that we are all responsible in terms of the work that we do, in terms of working together, in terms of bringing good instead of, I'm not going to say evil. I guess I am going to say evil, bringing good instead of evil. It's reminiscent of other missions. But that, I think, maybe could be the right sort of addition to this, is responsibility.
Since we're all lawyers, maybe the commitment is that the company does something that is pro bono, right? Lawyers, the law is so important, and access to the law is so important that we as a profession commit to doing free legal services. And maybe that's an additional commitment, is that one of the principles to commit to is doing something that's in the public interest.
Interesting. The one thing that I was sort of trying to figure out, and to some extent I think maybe you've addressed it, but even is how much that freedom of expression actually plays back into encouraging the innovation, and that you're sort of creating this virtuous cycle where enabling that freedom of expression then comes back to you in terms of new innovations and new things that can be done.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that gets to the responsibility point. It also gets to the point where if you're user-centric, you want to bring content, you want to bring information to your users that's the most open, the most that's not limited by any voice. So I think I think it absolutely creates innovation. It does create that virtuous circle.
Great. Well, I think we've used up the time for you guys. I want to thank you very much for having this conversation, which again, hopefully is just the beginning of a longer conversation. We'll hopefully continue it both online and hopefully we'll have you back here again at some point to sort of see where this goes and see what we can do with it. So if everyone could thank the General Counsels here for taking part.